All right, Gator fans, we are joined today by Blake Alderman of Swamp 247. Blake, thanks for coming and hanging out today.
Absolutely. I appreciate you having me on.
All right, so the Gators have had a lot of big name recruits in the Swamp for the last two home games. Let's talk about the list for Charlotte first. There was some guys who are committed elsewhere, really big name guys. Charles Lester is a Florida State commit. Jeremiah Smith, obviously, Ohio State commitment and wide receiver that everybody wants. And then Dallas Wilson, who is a four-star wide receiver committed to Oregon. Number 5 wide receiver in the country, though. Let's talk a little bit about having such big name guys in there for kind of a lackluster performance.
Yeah, I called it a sneaky good visitor list just because I don't know, middle of last week, I'm thinking like, man, if this isn't a strong visitor list, I may just sit at home, watch it, do some work from home, no need to be out there late at night. Well, around later part of the week, I was like, yeah, that's not happening. It was a good list. Whenever you have the guys that were committed elsewhere, you mentioned those, the Lesters, the Jeremiah Smiths, but they even had DeAndre Robinson, the Texas commit, Jarek Gibson, the 4-star running back, committed to Texas as well. That was his second straight visit to Florida. I think of all those guys, whenever you look at the guys in general, I think DeAndre Robinson is maybe a guy to continue to keep track of going forward. He mentioned that Florida is still continuing to recruit him very hard. You lose McCray earlier a couple weeks ago whenever he opened his recruitment back up. So now Florida's got a need on the defensive line that continues to carry over. If you look at the class right now, plenty of those guys, if you look at 24/7 profiles, they're listed as defensive linemen, but really the only true guy that is seen as a hand in the dirt type of defensive lineman is Nasir Johnson. So that need carries over. I think that DeAndre Robinson is a guy that they're going to continue to push pretty hard, just a local guy there, right up there in Orlando. Florida finished second for him whenever he picked Texas there in July. Charles Lester, I thought was an interesting one because that was a big surprise visit to me. That was one that, when he walks out there of the building and you see him up there, you're like, whoa, what is this guy doing there? Speaking to him after the game, he mentioned that he could possibly pop back into Florida for one, maybe two more games. He's kind of checking to see how his schedule goes. He'll continue to visit FSU, he said, too. So he's clearly trying to fit some things in there. But I think another interesting part was that that December 8th weekend there, he's planning to take an official visit to Florida. So, this is a guy that could potentially take, if he makes all these planned visits, take 3 visits to Florida there before the early signing period. So that's, I think, a guy to keep an eye on. Jeremiah Smith obviously continues to be a big focus for Florida. The in-state schools, Florida State, Miami, Florida, they're continuing to try to push for him. He's going to continue to take some visits. Committed to Ohio State seems like a tough flip for really anybody at this point. But he's going to keep the door cracked in the sense of he's going to take visits. He's going to see how these teams play. He's going to, hear the recruiting pitches that these coaches have for him. So we'll see how things go. I think that a visit date for him to get back to Florida potentially could be the Florida State game there in November. That seems to be the plan for the family right now. So, like I said, it was a sneaky good visitor list there for Florida. And, whenever you see that many guys committed elsewhere show up in the stands, you always have to take a second look and see how serious maybe they are. Was it just kind of taking a visit to take a visit? But a good portion of those guys, I think, are realistically giving Florida a shot and listening to what the coaches have to say.
Okay, so a lot to unpack there. Let's start with Lester. Do you think that Florida has a shot to flip him? Obviously, this is kind of out of the blue. Jeremiah Smith coming to Gainesville, even though he's committed to Ohio State, isn't a shock. He's been there a lot. We've heard him say he wants to take his trips. He wants to go to games. So I don't think that anybody's necessarily caught off guard by him being in the stands. But Charles Lester was a little bit of a surprise. Do you think Florida State should be concerned?
Concerned in the sense that you've got a guy that's planning to take not just one visit. That's not a situation where a guy pops in for a visit and we'll see how things go going forward if I'm going to make another visit or if I'm not. But this is a guy that's talking about taking a handful of other visits. He even said whenever we caught up with him after the game that, things have been kind of low key between him and Florida, that's a team that really hasn't gotten a lot of conversation and as far as his recruitment going forward. I know that before he committed to Florida State, Colorado was a team in the mix there. I think Alabama was in there. Some other teams were kind of in and out with him. I think Georgia was another one that was in there as well. Florida really wasn't talked about very much. It always kind of seemed like this was a guy that, maybe at the start of this year to where it was, when is this guy going to be committing to Florida State? He's a guy that grew up a childhood fan of Florida State. So there are a lot of factors there that I think do give Florida State the edge to where if they really kind of put the screws to him and say like, look, man, you need to shut this down. You've got a guy that grew up a fan, seems happy with that decision. Is that cause him to really shut the process down? That's something you probably need to keep an eye on. But as far as, is he a guy that it's a possibility of a flip? I think it's certainly something to keep an eye on. If you've got a guy that's going to continue to take these visits, if he gives them a chance to continue to recruit him, Florida's obviously looking for another defensive back. He's a guy that I would put on a recruiting board right now if I was writing something up, along with guys like Zay Mincy, Jameer Grimsley, and a couple others. So an official visit there for December, if he makes that as planned, that's another chance for them to really get him on campus right there before the early signing period. So I definitely think that he's someone to keep an eye on for a flip.
What about Gibson? I think that Jared Gibson is somebody who Florida was in it for originally, right at the beginning before he committed. Some of the people that I talk to pretty regularly kind of feel like Florida has gotten, their toe in the door a little bit. I'm not saying he's going to flip and commit to Florida tomorrow or anything like that, but I think that UF likes some of the conversations that they've had with him. Are you hearing the same thing?
I know that they felt that the visit went really good this past weekend. That was someone that got a good amount of time around the coaching staff. They're continuing to recruit him and a couple other guys at running back because they would like to take a second guy. Billy likes to keep that stable of 5 running backs, and they're kind of figuring out numbers as far as, could a guy like Montrell Johnson perhaps test the NFL waters? You've got Cam Carroll, who had that big injury this year. Will he be able to contribute next year? So there are some conversations taking place on how they want to work numbers around for a second running back, but you've got a guy like Jared Gibson, local guy from Gainesville, really talented himself, was actually committed to Florida back when Dan Mullen was on staff. I think it was his freshman year, something like that. He had committed to Florida and eventually backed off of that. I know that there's some interest on his end. I'm not sure that I'm really hot and heavy on this is a guy that Florida needs to watch out for as far as or Florida fans need to keep an eye out for as a possible flip. I think that the visits he's taken, because he has taken 2, are more of a convenience thing personally. You've got a guy that visited for the Tennessee game with a handful of those IMG guys. He had mentioned that Florida's been recruiting him about, getting up for a game at least. And then IMG was off this past weekend, so he was back home in Gainesville seeing family. So that wasn't a far drive. If he continues to take some visits at Florida and makes it sort of a regular thing, maybe sets an official visit at some point, I think that may be something to where you may want to get a little bit more excited. And again, he is a guy that is being recruited by Florida, does seem to have a little bit of interest there, but I'm just not ready to really put him on any sort of flip watch at this point.
All right. We talked about Jeremiah Smith, and we know that is a big long shot. Florida didn't do great offensively on Saturday. They definitely didn't, throw the ball down the field or really make great use of any of their wide receivers. Do you think that potentially hurts Florida? Do you think that Jeremiah Smith then maybe could see it as like, hey, well, if I was in this offense, they would tailor it to me? I mean, how does a game like Saturday play with a recruit like that?
I actually talked with his dad last night, and I'm looking forward to I have a coworker that's going to be planning to go out to practice today, kind of hearing some of the things that Jeremiah himself has to say about the visit. But I don't know that really a game like that really plays a big factor in the grand scheme of things. There was plenty of kids that I talked to after they visited this past Saturday that were like, oh, it was a good game. It was a good atmosphere. Sure, there were some things to be corrected. So I think whenever you see where Florida did struggle in some areas, there are some things that, if they can continue to correct those problems, it's kind of the long game, I guess, whenever you look at recruiting. And talking to his dad, Jeremiah had mentioned that he's really has thought that, really all of the in-state schools in Florida have been playing pretty well. They're kind of on the upward trend, I guess, as far as what they put together last year to this year. So I think in general, I don't know that that's really a game to where, he eliminates Florida or anything. I think he's going to continue to keep tabs on things on really all those 3 in-state teams, as well as Ohio State going forward. So I don't know that I'd really count this off as a big blow to Florida in the recruitment, because he did have a really good time. He got time around the coaching staff. The fans were there. I think the student section had like a Jeremiah to the swamp sign or something that he was retweeting. So there are parts about Florida. Again, I think that this recruitment in general is going to be a tough flip for everybody. He's really close with Brian Hartline at Ohio State. He really likes what that program in general has done with wide receivers. But I don't know that the lack of offensive explosion and the struggles they had in the red zone were something that's really going to like just kind of take the floor out from Florida in this recruitment.
All right, let's talk a little bit about some of the visitors that came to the Tennessee game. Obviously, one of the best atmospheres the Swamp's had in a while. Lots and lots of big name guys there. Both guys committed to us, and guys that Florida still has on their watch list. Two really local kids would be LJ McCray and Zay Mincy from Daytona Beach mainland. Obviously, those are ones that the Gators would really like to have. Did you hear anything about how those visits went?
They both went well from everything I've got, but I mean, Florida does a good job on these guys when they're on campus. There's really not a situation where these guys that get sort of wined and dined and everyone's showing them love and everything there that really is a negative to any of these kids. I think that whenever you look at from talking with LJ McCray, he really was impressed with the defensive performance that Florida had. They had a really good defensive game. I mean, they played really good on defense so far this season, but that defense was really active and right there in front of him. I think that it sort of confirms the pitch that Florida had in June, where they were sitting there telling him, we're going to be, on the rise. We're building something for the future. All those types of pitches, that kind of confirms what they were saying to him whenever they see them get a big win like that in that atmosphere that he was in. Talking to LJ, he is very guarded in a lot of things he says. He's very savvy with the media. If you talk to him, he's all five of those teams that are in it for him: the Auburns, Florida State, Florida, Miami, Georgia. He doesn't have a bad pick if you ask him. But the two I hear the most about are Florida and Georgia. I think Florida State is a team that I maybe would keep an eye on outside of those two, just because they have the official visit in their back pocket coming up next month. That'll be a chance for them to really get roll out the red carpet for a multi-day visit for him. So I think that those are the two teams to keep an eye on. And Xavier Mincy, I hear mostly Florida, Miami. I think that this is a guy that if you asked me 3-4 months ago, it seemed like Florida was sort of running away with this recruitment. But he was one that never really seemed like he was going to, rush the process, was going to continue to take some visits. It seemed like Alabama maybe was Florida's biggest competition there in June, but Miami really surged there after a late July visit, continued to work on him there in August. He was in town for, I believe, their game against A&M. So that's one where I think it's gotten a little bit closer. I'd probably give Florida the edge right now, but he's talking about possibly having some kind of silent decision right now at some point in the season and not announcing until January for the All-American Bowl. So this is a recruitment that even if he makes a silent commitment, he's not planning to announce it till January. So, I mean, a silent commitment really doesn't mean much because you can always change your mind with that. But I think Florida's probably the team that I'd give the edge right now. But I do think that Miami's made it pretty close.
Long way to go till January for sure. Okay, so how many do you think Florida takes in the 2024 class?
I don't know that they really have a magic number right now. I think 25 would, the normal class size, if you have a full class, would probably be ideally what they would look at right there. They've got 21 in the fold right now. I think Florida really just sees their roster as it's young. They really aren't going to turn away anybody that they feel like can contribute to them, whether it's soon or long term, someone that they really like. There's areas that they really want to continue to fill. Defensive line, they'd love to sign another cornerback. They'd love another wide receiver. Offensive tackle is still a need that they want to fill. So it just kind of depends right now. I think that you would probably expect them to shoot for more of a full 25-man class if things work out. And even if they don't, I think that if they miss on some of these high school guys left on the board, you just use those spots for the portal. So that's pretty much normal how it is now. If you don't hit the numbers you would like to hit as far as the high school recruiting, you just carry that over to the portal and see what's in there. So, but I think there's not an ideal plan, it seems, as far as how many they're going to take. But I think a full class would probably be, in a perfect world, what they would like.
Okay, so full class means four spots left. If you had to pick today, who would you say Florida's most likely to close with?
I think that right now I'd probably say Mincy, just because I do think that Florida's leaning towards him. Jordan Seaton, I think, is a true battle. LJ McCray, I think Georgia, I'd probably give them the slight edge right now, but that's a recruitment that really is tough because he just really does seem to like everybody. As far as running backs, I don't think anything there. Wide receiver, I'm not too sure about them flipping Jeremiah Smith. I think that right now I'd say Zay Mincy is probably the safe bet. Jameer Grimsley, I think, is the biggest wild card for me, the 4-star defensive back committed to Alabama. They're out of Texas. just because he's planning to take a visit to Florida there in November for their game against Arkansas. He grew up a big Florida fan. They're playing well. He wanted to see how they would play this season. I think that that's probably the next in line that I would say for Florida as far as guys to keep an eye on. So I don't know. It's tough because I would say Mincy's probably the most likely if I had to pick one of the bunch of the targets left on the board for Florida. But there really are so many true battles right now to where what I say right now really could change 30,000 times by the time these guys make their decisions or even signing day rolls around.
All right, Blake, it's always fun. We appreciate you. Tell everybody watching and listening where they can find your work and follow you on social media.
Sure. Swamp 24/7. It's Florida's 24/7 sports site. Recruiting's busy all the time there. I'm still catching up to a lot of these visitors that have been there. And my Twitter handle is at Blake_Alderman. Usually most of my content is on there. So that's usually where you can find me.
All right. Well, we appreciate it. Have a great day and go Gators.
Thanks. Appreciate you having me on.